you, Barry, for that very, very kind introduction. It is an enormous honor for me to be invited to participate in this distinguished public lecture series. I signed the announcement, the poster for the program, and then walked past the hall that has previous participants. It's a very, very distinguished list. It's a great honor to be included among them. It also was an enormous honor and pleasure to serve on the Board of Governors of the Rajaratnam School. When I first came in 2007, I could see that a very strong foundation had been laid through the Institute for Defense and Strategic Studies under the leadership of Ambassador, later President S.R. Nathan. And then Barry Dester and his colleagues have carried what is now the Rajaratnam School to an even higher level. It is, in my judgment, the best school of international affairs in Asia, one of the very best in the world. And all those who are involved in it, who are faculty, students, alumni, friends, all of you can take enormous pride in what has been achieved in a very, very short space of time. It was a great honor to serve on the board. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Singapore to talk to you in this new facility, which I've never been in before. And congratulations on the physical plant as well. Much of the current discussion of U.S.-China relations focuses on what scholars of international politics would call the structural determinants of their relationship, whether through the application of realist models, such as the well-known power transition theory, which focuses on the relationship between a rising power and an established power, or models drawn from international political economy, such as the unbalanced interdependence between economies with chronic trade capital account imbalances. These models are extremely valuable. They provide a lot of insight. But as useful as they are, they tend to overlook what I call the socio-cultural aspects of the relationship, the ways in which elites and publics in the two countries in question view their own country, the other country, and the relationship between them, and how those perspectives in turn are rooted in deeper aspects of each country's political culture. In other words, they sometimes miss the distinctive flavor of the U.S.-China relationship and how it might differ from the relationship between two other countries in similar circumstances. It is, in fact, that deeper dimension that I call socio-cultural analysis that I want to explore today. Now, as a mnemonic device to guide you through my presentation, I want you to imagine a large moving van filled with the cultural and perceptual baggage that each country brings to their common relationship. And we'll unpack that van today and examine some of the larger containers inside it. If you'll forgive the play on words, we're going to find three such large containers in our van. They include values, assumptions, and national narratives, VAN. Please don't forget them. But before I unpack the van with you and explore these three dimensions of sociocultural analysis, let me tell you a story that explains my interest in this particular topic, and a particular episode, an event that occurred 30 years ago now that has stuck with me in a way that few similar events have. Back in the mid-1980s, when I was working at the Brookings Institution in Washington, an executive from the international telecommunications firm Cable and Wireless came to Washington from Britain to explore what was going on in U.S.-China relations. This was a period of growing tension, what in my book I called storm clouds in the relationship, that were beginning to replace that sense of honeymoon that had developed right after normalization a few years before. And for reasons that he never made clear or explicit, this Cable and Wireless executive was concerned. These tensions clearly posed some kind of political risk to his work, to either an actual venture or a proposed venture. And he needed to come to Washington, he felt, to figure out what was going on. He asked his staff in Washington to arrange a lunch, which he could explore the various aspects of the relationship, the issues at stake. And if you remember that great film Casablanca, in which Inspector Renault, played by Claude Rains, pulls together the usual suspects to discuss a crime. The executives, cable and wireless staff in Washington pulled together a group of Chinese and American scholars and practitioners, all of whom knew each other, all of whom knew the issues. And we met at a neutral location, a Middle Eastern restaurant not far off of DuPont Circle, to go over the issues. We went at each other for the entire lunch, very politely but very pointedly. At the end of the lunch, just before this Bisbee executive got up to leave, he leaned back in his chair and he said, "Do you know what the problem is here? You two are so bloody similar." Now this shocked the entire group because we'd been arguing for probably 2 hours. We were so shocked that nobody had time to ask what he meant. And he got up and left forthwith. And that idea, "you two are so bloody similar," has stuck in my mind for almost 30 years now. And I've been wondering, what did he mean? In what ways could countries that are so different strike this kind of intelligent visitor as being so bloody similar? I've thought about this from time to time over the last several decades, but have thought about it more intensely recently because I've been given the opportunity to teach a course on U.S.-China relations to 3rd and 4th year undergraduates at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. The course is large. It has about 140 students. Since HKUST is a public university, the overwhelming majority of them are from Hong Kong. But there is a substantial number of mainland Chinese students, plus a smattering of exchange students from the United States, Europe, and elsewhere in Asia. As you would expect, a large percentage of the students in my class are majoring in science and engineering and are taking this course as part of their general education requirements. Few of them have any background whatsoever in international relations theory or in U.S.-China relations. And therefore, I've had to spend a fair amount of time exploring some rather fundamental questions about the relationship, including its historical background, the competing theoretical perspectives that might explain it, and some of the cultural and social factors I've just mentioned. And indeed, many of the students tell me that they would have liked even more attention to these deeper cultural factors and less attention to what they see as the abstractions of international political theory. So my experience in Lecture Theater E at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology has encouraged me to think more about the meaning of the enigmatic statement by the cable and wireless executive and about the sociocultural aspects of the U.S.-China relationship. And I'd like to share my preliminary conclusions with you. I've increasingly focused on 3 key questions. Are the two countries different? Or, as he suggested, in some ways, are they actually surprisingly similar? How do these similarities and differences affect their relationship? Could it be that the similarities cause as many difficulties as the differences? And finally, as the domestic and international situations of each country undergoes rapid change, largely as the result of globalization, is it possible that their socio-cultural characteristics will actually converge over time? Are Chinese in some ways becoming more American? Are Americans conceivably becoming more Chinese? And if there are such changes, how will they affect the future course of the U.S.-China relationship? So let's turn first to that first big box, the box that I've labeled values. One of the most frequently cited differences between the political cultures of China and America is that American culture is more individualist, whereas Chinese culture is more collectivist. That is, American society is rooted in the concepts of diversity, liberty, and individual rights, while Chinese society has traditionally been rooted in concepts of harmony, order, and individual responsibilities. That's not to say that either society has always lived up to those norms, or that these values are universally shared within either of them. But these have been the center of gravity of the two cultures. These have been the values to which the two societies have generally aspired. Different scholars, while agreeing on this pattern, have traced these differences to different sources. Some have traced them to different patterns of agricultural production. One of the earliest and most extreme versions of this approach was the so-called hydraulic theory of civilization associated with Karl Wittfogel. He used it to explain the emergence of powerful authoritarian states, not only China, but in those societies that required large-scale irrigation work to support farming. More recently, a young anthropologist at my university, Thomas Talhelm, has presented a somewhat softer version of the same model, in which he uses to explain not Oriental despotism, as Wittfogel did, but rather the sort of collectivist mentality I've been discussing here. His research, along with that of others in similar veins, was summarized by a professor of anthropology at Stanford, T.J. Luhrmann, in a widely read op-ed in the New York Times. Talhelm's work actually sees differences within China between wheat growers in the north and rice producers in the south, but Luhrmann expands on his work to distinguish more generally between what she calls rice people, whose cultures are based in collective methods of production, and wheat people, whose cultures are based on smaller scale family farms. And she argues that today many Asian cultures are shaped by the ways of thinking of rice people, while many Western cultures are shaped by the experiences of wheat people. I would add a third category, nomadic or cowboy people, whose means of production are even more individualistic. And anyone familiar with American popular culture will recognize the differences between ranchers and wheat farmers reflected in many American Western movies, but also in the classic Western song, "Don't Fence Me In." Others have traced the differences between Western individualism and Asian collectivism to the different needs for political order in especially Chinese and American societies. Underpopulated and wealthy America could afford limited government and individual rights, whereas densely populated China, with many areas of poverty and with episodic periods of protest and rebellion, required a state with what the Hungarian-born French sinologist Etienne Balache described as having totalitarian tendencies, although in the pre-modern period, not totalitarian capabilities. Still, other scholars, such as the Harvard sinologist Du Weiming, have emphasized the importance of the dominant political philosophies in the two societies: Confucianism in China, Locke in Britain, Thomas Paine in the United States. Whichever of these explanations is most powerful to you, and however these differences emerge, in terms of contemporary U.S.-China relations, the differences between these two political cultures is seen first and foremost in the two countries' divergent conceptions of human rights. China focuses on social and economic rights, the right to an adequate standard of living, decent housing, adequate education, good health, and economic security in old age. While not neglecting these things, America focuses more on civil and political rights, the individual's rights to free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom from arbitrary arrest, the right to a fair trial. And these two clusters or groups of human rights are both embodied in two different international conventions: the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And unsurprisingly, given the differences I've just outlined in the two countries' political cultures, China has signed both of these conventions, but ratified only one, the Convention on Social and Economic Rights. Equally predictably, the United States has signed both, but ratified only the other, the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and even then, with many reservations. So even in their explicit legal conformity, ratification of international conventions on human rights, this difference in political culture becomes very, very clear. Beyond diverging definitions of human rights, the differences I've been discussing are also embodied in two different definitions of democracy. Like virtually all contemporary societies, both China and the US are committed in principle to democracy, but they define the term in very different ways. Americans stress what might be called democratic procedures, focusing above all on free and competitive elections to legislative and executive positions. Chinese stress substantive outcomes, focusing on whether the policies produced by democratic institutions reflect the interests of the population as a whole. Chinese are therefore more willing to accept non-pluralistic forms of democracy, such as the consultative democratic experiments conducted in some villages in China, or the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference in Beijing. whereas Americans in general are adamantly unwilling to accept that any non-pluralistic system can properly be termed a democracy. Now, given the importance of the human rights issue in the U.S.-China relationship, these differences in definition, based in different socio-cultural norms and values, are clearly a complicating factor. But an emerging, but as yet unresolved question is whether these socio-cultural differences may be narrowing as a result of a variety of social and economic changes in China. Will the emergence of prosperous middle classes, coupled with an entire generation composed largely of only children, produce possibly a more individualistic society, chafing against what it regards as outdated restrictions and demanding more rights and a more responsive political system? I regard this as a possibility, an intriguing one, but I also suspect there will be powerful forces that will resist the trend. Not only the state and the party, which will continuously invoke the need for order and will point to what it will portray as the excessively individualistic and therefore politically chaotic and economically unsustainable character of contemporary Europe and America, but also older and more conservative elements of society who will continue to value social harmony and individual responsibility. So there may be change in China, but I think it's premature to think that it will go too far, especially as reflected in institutions. In the U.S., too, there are some signs of a reaction to what is considered excessive individualism through variants of what some call communitarianism as a countervailing set of values juxtaposed to individualism. But although there's some growing interest in communitarian approaches, an even more powerful trend in recent years has been the resurgence of libertarianism in the United States, including, interestingly, among the millennial generation, as a reaction to the perceived expense and intrusiveness of the welfare state and, more recently, the national security state. Communitarianism is therefore unlikely to become dominant, given the strong individualistic tendencies in American culture. Nor is libertarianism likely to prevail, given that popular support for most specific government programs and policies remains strong, if not for the general concept of big government. Americans don't like big government, but they like what big government does. The often quoted signs that appear during some Tea Party rallies, "Keep the government's hands off my Medicare," as if that was something the private sector did, is probably the best example of this. Americans don't like big government. Politicians campaign against it, but they like virtually everything that big government does. So I believe that the U.S. political culture will continue to be a blend of individualism and some collectivism, but with the balance remaining strongly tilted towards individualism. If there is any convergence, therefore, it is more likely to be Chinese convergence with American individualism rather than American convergence with Chinese collectivism. But even that is likely to be limited. When we turn to the next big box, the assumptions that Chinese and American societies carry to the conduct of international affairs, we see a fascinating mixture of differences and similarities, including the crucial similarity that I believe the British executive from Cable and Wireless had perceived during the luncheon in Washington so many years ago. The most obvious difference is that American grand strategy has been based far more on liberal notions of international affairs than has its equivalent in China. As Alistair Ian Johnston of Harvard has demonstrated, Chinese strategic culture has always been essentially realist. It assumes that countries will act based on their immediate national interests, and that China should behave the same way. Nation states, realists assume, will not be altruistic. Any norms and institutions that are created by stronger powers will be designed to promote their own interests, rather than the general welfare of an international community. In contrast, American strategic culture has many more liberal, even idealistic elements. There is a powerful and enduring strain of thinking that focuses on the creation of international institutions that can resolve differences, respond to aggression, promote trade, reduce poverty, and that the United States has a moral obligation to promote economic development, security, and human rights abroad. But beneath this apparent difference between the realist Chinese and the liberal Americans, there is an underlying similarity, which represents a partial synthesis of these two seemingly contradictory perspectives. It can best be described by a term that I first heard from Yan Xuetong in a video recorded, an oft-viewed video in a debate at Tsinghua University with his fellow realist, John Mearsheimer. And that term is moral realism. That is, both countries are realists when they need to be, which has been far more often for a relatively weak China than for a relatively powerful United States. But both countries have had periods of realism. It's, as I say, that realism is more likely for China, that is expected to follow international rules written by others, than for the United States that wrote most of those rules. But both countries are able to find moral justifications for their foreign policies beyond the pragmatic ones of power and interest. And I believe that this is what the cable and wireless executive, when he was referring to when he saw Chinese and Americans as so bloody similar. Both groups of participants at the luncheon he hosted, whether Chinese or American, were advancing their country's national interests. But both groups were presenting them in highly moral terms. The Americans presented themselves as upholding principles such as universal human rights. The Chinese, on the other side of the table, were invoking other principles, such as non-intervention in other countries' internal affairs. To each country, therefore, international politics is a struggle between right and wrong, not just a struggle for power, with less room for compromise and less possibility of mutual understanding than a purely pragmatic or realist approach would entail. Now, the problem is that, as in the case of democracy, the two societies have quite different definitions of the normative and moral principles that define what is right and what is wrong. I see this as a tension between China's dedication to a set of what I call modern principles and American commitment to a set of what I call postmodern principles. China holds officially to core Westphalian principles, the principles that underlie the creation of the modern state system after the Peace of Westphalia. Juridically equal states, each sovereign over its own territory, protected by the principles of territorial integrity and national sovereignty and non-intervention in internal affairs. In contrast, the United States increasingly holds to what can be regarded as postmodern principles that modify Westphalia, the recognition of problems that transcend formal territorial borders, and that sometimes can justify or even require incursions on national sovereignty and violations of territorial integrity. This is what justifies Americans' criticism of other countries' human rights records, and what legitimates the principle abbreviated as R2P, the responsibility to protect those who are the victims of humanitarian crises or gross violations of human rights, regardless of national boundaries. The utility of the term moral realism is also that it helps us understand that both countries see a link between morality and power. We are now all familiar with the term soft power, promoted most actively by Joseph Nye at Harvard. This concept assumes that countries will have influence over others, not only because of their ability to use economic or military coercion, their hard power, or even the size and the attractiveness of their domestic markets, which, following Walter Russell Mead, I call their sticky power, but also because of the attractiveness of their cultures and the appeal of the ideals and values that they project in their foreign policies. While this is called soft power, it actually can have a hard edge to it that is crucial to an understanding of moral realism. Values and ideals can be used first by realists to legitimate the use of hard power, as Yan Xuetong implied. And also, conversely, it can be used to delegitimize the use of hard power by others. Thus, the United States justifies its use of hard power by reference to its commitments to liberal norms and post-war institutions and values, while China attempts to delegitimize the U.S. development and use of hard power, including both military force and economic sanctions, by invoking Westphalian principles and by characterizing much of American contemporary foreign policy as based on what they call outmoded, ideologically based Cold War thinking. And beneath these different versions of moral realism lies yet another pair of differing assumptions that may be the most important of all. On one side is the American belief in universalism, the idea that all societies will eventually converge on the social and political values and the political and economic systems of the sort pioneered in the West and now championed by the United States. On the other side is the Chinese belief in particularism, that societies all have the right to be different, perhaps especially China. This is reflected, of course, in the 19th century Chinese view of 中学为基，西学为用, Chinese learning as the basis, Western learning as some technological peripheral knowledge, and the Chinese hope that a wide range of social institutions should retain a distinctively Chinese character. Whether it's 中国特色的 Chinese 社会主义, socialism with Chinese characteristics, or whether it is social science with Chinese characteristics, or whether it's democracy with Chinese characteristics, the idea is that China will be different. China will be particularist. It will not succumb to the temptations of universal models that do not apply to them. Paradoxically, these differences run parallel to another similarity. Both countries believe that they are exceptional in ways that will earn them the respect and deference of other countries. And both believe that that exceptionalism gives them the right to lead. But the difference between American universalism and Chinese particularism makes the common denominator of exceptionalism quite different. American exceptionalism is rooted in the belief that America is an exceptional manifestation of universally valid values and institutions, whereas Chinese exceptionalism is rooted in the belief that China has every reason to be an exception to American values and institutions, precisely because they are not necessarily universally valid. The difference between the so-called Washington Consensus and the Beijing Consensus can most easily be understood in these terms. The Washington Consensus is a statement of the universal validity of a certain model of development. The Beijing Consensus is not yet presented as an alternative model that Beijing deems to be universally valid. Instead, and on the contrary, it is better understood as the insistence that each country should define its own path on the basis of its own preferences and circumstances. The Beijing Consensus, in other words, is a particularistic denial of the universalism that is inherent in the Washington Consensus. Now, is there any chance of change or convergence in these sets of assumptions? The main possibility I see is that a growing recognition of the declining relative power of the United States, a trend that I see occurring, but that others in the United States still strongly deny, would shift the balance in American strategic thinking away from liberalism or idealism and toward realism. As I've already indicated, international liberalism is in some ways the luxury of the strong, or perhaps the last hope for the very weak. If the balance should shift from liberalism toward realism as a shift, a perceived or an acknowledged shift in relative American power might predict, then the United States may then, as realists such as John Mearsheimer have always recommended, select its commitments more carefully, or even begin to acknowledge that the global convergence of values and identities may be limited and slow. This may also entail a partial shift from universalism to particularism, although I believe that this would occur more out of despair and disdain for those who reject American values and institutions than out of genuine respect for different choices. On the Chinese side, if China's efforts at rebalancing its economy succeed and are accompanied by some kind of effective political reform, then China may be less modest about the applicability of its development model and begin more actively to promote it as a universally applicable alternative to the Washington Consensus, at least in Asia. It will be particularly interesting to see which direction China takes through the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Still, I suspect that the center of gravity in both countries will continue to reflect moral realism, and that the two countries will still define their underlying moral principles quite differently. I also expect that the United States will remain, for the foreseeable future, far more universalist in its thinking than China. Finally, when we remove the third big crate from our moving van and examine the national narratives of the two countries, the way in which they view their international histories and forecast their futures, we again see a sharp contrast, although also a striking terminological similarity. As we all know, China's prevailing national narrative in the modern era has been one of national humiliation. The idea that China was humiliated at the hands of first the West, including the United States, and then, and most egregiously, Japan. The fact that many Japanese hold a very different national narrative is precisely the cause of much of the mutual resentment and distrust between the two countries. In contrast, the dominant national narrative of the United States has been one of benevolent, even altruistic hegemony. The United States as unintentionally gaining a dominant position after World War II, but exercising its newfound relative power to uphold peace and stability regionally and globally, and to promote the development of less developed societies through its foreign aid programs, its support of international financial institutions, and its openness to imports from emerging markets. Now, I was first exposed to this national narrative of benevolent leadership, altruistic hegemony, if you will, in a very personal way. But again, I remember vividly. I was 6 years old at the time, and my elementary school in New York City had a little class play for United Nations Day. We all got to wear flags representing the members of the United Nations. Weren't that many at that time, so all of us got to wear one. I, as the youngest student in the class, got to wear the flag of the United States. So I was the United States in this skit. The skit was a very simple one. First, all of us went around pretending to shoot each other. Bang, 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 bang. And every country fell to the ground except me. That was World War II, and I was the only survivor. My role was then to walk around the stage, one by one, reaching down, taking the hand of France, pulling France to its feet, pulling England to its feet. I forget whether I pulled China to its feet or not. I certainly should have, because that would have been part of the American national narrative. And just like that enigmatic comment about being bloody similar to the Chinese, this little class skit has stuck in my mind with great tenacity ever since I was about 6 years old, which is now a long time ago, because it basically taught me the narrative. Americans had survived World War II by good fortune, did nothing except nobody shot me down, I guess. And my job as America was to go and help everybody else get to their feet. Now, in particular, well, that's the general narrative. I think the United States generally regards itself as the country that has done more than any other to facilitate and support the recent rise of China. We'll see in a minute how that's very, very different than the Chinese national narrative. So each country has responded to the other's national narrative in increasingly critical ways. Well, I think most Chinese acknowledge some small differences between the American role in China in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and the roles of the other Western powers in Japan, and acknowledge the benefits that China has obtained more recently from integrating itself into the international order led by the United States. Chinese still officially portray the United States as consistently trying to prevent China's peaceful rise. In other words, instead of pulling it up, instead trying to use every means to keep it down, through containment, through fragmentation, and through subversion. A view that appears to have significant resonance within Chinese society, especially among young male netizens, since it is promoted by the national media and the national education system, and is reinforced by numerous contemporary events which can be seen or portrayed as evidence of a continued policy of trying to obstruct China's rise. Conversely, the United States sees China not only as denying or downplaying American support for its reform and opening, but also as failing to embrace the implications and responsibilities that come from its recent economic successes, culminating most recently in Barack Obama's criticism of China's tendency to free ride on the international system, rather than to act as a fully responsible stakeholder in that system from which it has benefited so much. Moreover, as China has continued to rise, its leaders have put forward a new narrative of China's future, termed the Chinese Dream. The parallel to the longer-standing American dream is striking, and probably not entirely coincidental. Both countries then have a national dream to become or to remain a strong country militarily, a prosperous country economically, and an attractive country culturally in terms of soft power. Although the geopolitical implications are not always stated officially, there is a strong current in both societies that the dream also means becoming, remaining, dominant in its own region, and assuming or maintaining preeminence in the world as well. Again, to quote Yen Xuetung from his remarks at the Tsinghua debate with John Mearsheimer, quote, "Both of us want to be number one." Now, the intersection of these two national narratives, containing stories of both the past and the present, produces conflict and competition. The conflict is evident in one set of contending interpretations I have seen in U.S.-China relations for many years now. It's what I call the ungrateful meet the unrepentant, a China that does not appreciate the selfless American assistance that is provided, because Chinese believe that any assistance that may have been given was done out of American self-interest and therefore deserves no gratitude. And an America that does not acknowledge its transgressions against China, because the United States either does not regard them as transgressions or believes that they were entirely justifiable. So the ungrateful meet the unrepentant, and each is dissatisfied with the other's response. At the same time, the common desire to be number one will obviously produce competition, both regionally, as China seeks to reduce, though probably not entirely to eliminate, the American role in Asia, and to increase its own role in the world, including in areas previously seen as the American sphere of influence. Again, we can ask the question as to whether either country is likely to change its long-standing national narrative. One of, to me, the most fascinating and most puzzling and underanalyzed aspects of Jiang Zemin's tenure as China's leader was his speech on July 1, 2001, on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, in which, in summarizing the accomplishments of the party, he said, and I quote, "We have put an end once and for all to the history of diplomacy of humiliation in modern China." To say, as John clearly implied, that the century of humiliation was over and that China's national narrative could now be significantly altered was striking to me at the time. And yet, it was not commented on very much at the time. One rarely, if ever, sees any references subsequently to this startling proposition. This could be because the speech was primarily the place where John put forward his theory of the three represents, which was clearly the more important concept at the time. But one also has to ask whether the narrative of humiliation remains so resonant in China that it is unlikely to be rapidly altered, even if China continues to become more prosperous and more strong. In the same way, the American narrative is so deeply exceptionalist that President Obama was subject to scathing accusations recently that he had denied American exceptionalism when, in a seemingly casual remark, he noted that other countries might understandably regard themselves as exceptional as well. To say that others regard themselves as exceptional, the president found out, runs the risk of saying that America is not. And that comment was therefore retracted, and now every American political leader has to give lip service to American exceptionalism, and not as the exception to the rule, but as the exceptional embodiment of what America sees as universal values. So these two competing national narratives, which are well entrenched in both countries, have exacerbated the two countries' difficulty in defining a shared vision for their relationship going forward. China's so-called new type of major power relationship is, in essence, a demand for equal status with the United States. That would be the ultimate sign that China's era of national humiliation was over. And yet to accept that demand would also be the ultimate sign that America's period of international preeminence is over as well. Setting aside the issues of how the formula treats each side's core interests, which is a very important aspect of the problem from the American perspective, accepting the concept would therefore require a significant modification in each side's national narrative, and that will be difficult for both sides to accept. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether it will be harder for one than for the other. So in short, I've argued today that we need to pay due attention to the social-cultural foundations of the U.S.-China relationship as an essential supplement to the structuralist and rationalist approaches that tend to downplay, and even in the case of some scholars, to deny the importance of any cultural differences between the two countries, or any distinctive characteristics of either one. I've argued that when we do this, we see both predictable differences, but also surprising similarities. Yes, Chinese political culture is far less individualistic than the American, and that leads to significant differences in the ways in which the two countries define both human rights and democracy. But the two countries both value values. The two countries both value values, but value different values, leading not so much to an exaggeratedly moralistic approach to international affairs, but instead to what Yen Xuetung has called moral realism. This means that the two countries can readily engage in a competition for power, as realists would suggest, but that struggle will be couched in highly moralistic terms, as the British executives so insightfully perceived. I've also argued that the two countries have different preferences and predictions when it comes to identifying their preferred values and institutions. In other words, they are both moralistic, but their moralities are different. Moreover, Americans assume the universal applicability of their values and institutions. Chinese assume that China can and should remain distinctive, given the richness and weight of its own history. While both countries are exceptionalist, American exceptionalism is presented as the exceptional way in which America embodies universal aspirations, whereas Chinese exceptionalism is increasingly presented as the way in which China stands in contrast to, and therefore in rejection of, the American claims to universalism. And finally, I've argued that the two national narratives are in some ways in quite sharp contradiction. China's narrative is one of national humiliation, to which America remains largely blind. America's narrative is one of benevolent hegemonism, for which China should be grateful and which China still rejects. But in other ways, the narratives run parallel. Both speak in surprisingly similar terms about similar dreams, but both are dreams of power, status, and leadership in which each country stands in first place, at least regionally and possibly globally. And it's that similarity that poses a problem. To turn a familiar Chinese phrase on its head, if the two countries have the same dream, it may not be possible for them to occupy the same bed. Are these similarities and differences likely to endure? I've suggested that for a variety of reasons, China may become more individualistic, and maybe that America may become slightly more communitarian, but the differences are unlikely to disappear. And despite Jiang Zemin's surprising declaration that China's century of humiliation had ended, neither that narrative nor the American counterpart of indispensable leadership is likely to be fully rejected. Perhaps the most likely change is that if a relative shift in the balance of power continues, America may be forced to be more realistic in its international undertaking, and that China may be forced to become more liberal, in the sense that it will see the merits of either bolstering existing norms and institutions, or more likely, create some of its own. But since moralism can take either liberal or realist forms, I do not expect either country to become any less focused on the values that guide or justify their foreign policy. The moving van will continue to contain contents that are both similar and different, but that combination of similarity and differences will, in the end, nonetheless, continue to complicate the two countries' relationship. Thanks very much.